The roar of the crowd echoed through the packed MMA arena. The energy was electric, fueled by the anticipation of another brutal showdown. This wasn't Jason Statham's usual environment, far from it. The legendary action star had come to support an old friend, a retired coach who trained him years ago for a film. He hadn't expected any attention. He was here to sit back, enjoy the fights, and leave quietly. But the spotlight had other plans. Jason's seat was just a few rows back from the cage, easily visible to fans and fighters alike. Cameras caught his rugged face, and the announcer couldn't resist mentioning his name over the booming microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got Hollywood royalty in the house tonight. Give it up for Jason Statham." The crowd erupted in cheers, but not everyone was pleased. One of the fighters warming up backstage, Blake the Hurricane Harris, smirked as he watched the screen. Blake was a brash, undefeated MMA star known for his big mouth and bigger ego. He thrived on attention, and seeing Jason steal even a fraction of the crowd's focus rubbed him the wrong way. As the evening progressed, fight after fight brought more excitement. Blake's bout was the main event, and he had a plan to make sure all eyes stayed on him. When the time came for his entrance, the arena went dark and an over-the-top light show lit up the room. Blake strutted out, basking in the cheers and jeers alike. His energy was magnetic, but his attitude was toxic. Once inside the cage, Blake grabbed the microphone. His grin was wide, his tone mocking. "You know, I couldn't help but notice someone sitting out there," he began, pointing directly at Jason. The crowd murmured in confusion. "Yeah, you, Statham, Mr. Hollywood tough guy. You've been in, 100 fight scenes? But those aren't real fights, are they? Just a lot of fancy camera angles and stunt doubles." Jason raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but sharp. The crowd started to boo, but Blake wasn't done. "I bet you wouldn't last 30 seconds. In here with me," he sneered. "All that acting won't save you when you're face to face with the real deal." The tension in the arena was palpable. Jason remained seated, his body language cool and composed. Blake laughed, mistaking the silence for fear. "Come on, mate, stand up. Or are you just here to watch real men fight?" Jason finally stood. The crowd erupted, sensing something was about to go down. He walked slowly toward the edge of the cage, his eyes locked on Blake. The actor didn't need to say a word. His presence alone commanded attention. Blake leaned against the cage, grinning, like he'd already won. "What's the matter, mate? Lost your voice? Or maybe you just know better than to step in here with me?" Jason tilted his head, a small smirk forming. "You talk a lot," he said, his voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "But I've learned one thing in my life. The loudest one in the room is usually the weakest." The crowd exploded with cheers and laughter. Blake's grin faltered, but his cockiness didn't waver. "Big words for an actor," he shot back. "Why don't you prove it?" A hush fell over the crowd. Jason stepped back as if to leave, and then turned to a security guard. "Open the cage," he said simply. The arena erupted in chaos. Fans screamed, cameras zoomed in, and Blake's cocky smirk turned into a nervous laugh. "Wait, are you serious?" Blake asked, suddenly unsure. Jason climbed into the cage, his movements fluid and precise. The referee, bewildered but sensing the crowd's energy, gave a nod. Blake was still laughing, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I'll make this quick," Jason said, loosening his shoulders as he moved to the center of the cage. Blake raised his fists, still thinking this would be an easy win. The crowd chanted Jason's name, their excitement reaching a fever pitch. Little did they know, what was about to happen next would leave the entire arena in stunned silence. The arena was on fire with energy, the crowd's chants echoing like a storm. Blake, the Hurricane. Harris stood in the center of the cage, shifting from foot to foot, his hands raised in a mocking display of confidence. Across from him, Jason Statham stretched his arms, rolling his neck with a calm that bordered on unnerving. He didn't look like a man walking into a fight he wasn't prepared for. In fact, he looked almost bored. The referee stepped between them, raising his hands. "All right, gentlemen. This isn't an official fight, but if you're stepping in, I expect it to stay clean. No dirty shots, and if I say stop, you stop. Understood?" Jason nodded once, barely acknowledging the referee. Blake, on the other hand, smirked and winked at the crowd. Yeah, let's get on with it. I've got an after party to plan." The referee dropped his hands. "Let's go." Blake charged forward immediately, swinging wide with a left hook. Jason didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned just enough to the right for the punch to miss by a hair, his movement effortless. The crowd gasped at how smoothly he avoided the strike. Blake, undeterred, came in again, throwing a combination of punches. Jason ducked, weaved, and sidestepped, his hands still down by his sides. "Come on, old man," Blake taunted, frustration creeping into his voice. "Stop running and fight." Jason smiled, a small, infuriating smile that seemed to ignite Blake's temper even further. "Is that what you call fighting?" Jason said, his voice calm. "Because it feels more like flailing," Blake roared, rushing forward with a reckless series of punches. This time, Jason didn't just dodge. He stepped inside Blake's range, trapping the younger fighter's arm with a quick, precise grip. In a flash, Jason twisted, using Blake's momentum against him. The MMA fighter stumbled, barely catching himself before falling flat on his face. The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers. Blake spun around, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "You're dead, Statham," he growled, lunging forward again. This time he tried to take Jason to the ground, reaching for a double leg takedown. But Jason moved like water, his body flowing out of the way before Blake could make contact. With a swift movement, Jason planted a solid palm strike against Blake's chest, sending him stumbling backward. The crowd's reaction was deafening. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Jason wasn't just holding his own. He was completely outclassing the professional fighter. Blake, breathing heavily now, looked less confident. His movements became wilder, more desperate. Jason, on the other hand, was as cool as ever, his sharp eyes tracking every move. "This is what you call fighting?" Jason said, his voice laced with dry humor. "You're burning out, kid." Blake let out a frustrated yell, throwing a high kick aimed at Jason's head. But Jason blocked it effortlessly, his arm absorbing the blow like it was nothing. Before Blake could recover, Jason countered with a lightning-fast spinning back kick. His foot connected with Blake's midsection, sending the fighter crashing into the cage. The crowd erupted, half in awe, half in disbelief. Blake struggled to his feet, clutching his ribs. His bravado was gone now, replaced by a flicker of fear. You think you're so tough," he spat, his voice shaky. "You're just an actor." Jason tilted his head, his expression calm. "You're right," he said. "I'm just an actor. But I trained with the best, and trust me, fighting doesn't just live on a movie set." Blake hesitated, his confidence shattered. He glanced at the crowd, searching for support, but all he saw were faces cheering for Jason. He turned back just in time to see Jason closing the distance. Blake swung desperately, but Jason ducked and stepped inside his reach. With a single, fluid motion, Jason swept Blake's legs out from under him and sent him crashing to the mat. Jason stood over him, hands still relaxed at his sides. Blake, gasping for air, didn't even try to get up this time. The referee stepped in, raising a hand to signal the end. The crowd exploded in cheers, chanting Jason's name louder than ever. Cameras zoomed in on his calm, collected face. He didn't gloat or celebrate. He simply extended a hand to Blake, who reluctantly took it and stood up, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. "Good fight," Jason said, his tone neutral. Then, with a small smirk, he added, "But next time, less talk, more training." The arena erupted into laughter and applause as Jason walked out of the cage, leaving a stunned Blake behind. The legend of Jason Statham had just grown even larger, and everyone who witnessed the fight that night would be telling the story for years to come. The atmosphere in the arena was still buzzing as Jason Statham walked out of the cage, every step calculated and composed. The crowd's cheers echoed behind him, and flashes from cameras lit up his face like a paparazzi frenzy. He nodded politely at a few fans on his way back to his seat, acting as though what had just transpired was no big deal. But everyone else knew better. He had just humiliated one of the top-ranked MMA fighters in the world, and the internet was already ablaze with clips of the fight. Social media feeds were flooded with hashtags like Bosh Jason Statham fight and Blake got stomped. Blake. Harris, on the other hand, remained in the cage, seething. His chest heaved as he glared at Jason's back. The humiliation was too much for his inflated ego to handle. The crowd's jeers and laughter had been like daggers to his pride. A fighter like him, undefeated, untouchable, mocked and manhandled by an actor? The thought made his blood boil. As Jason reached his seat, his longtime friend and retired MMA coach Mike Carson leaned in with a wide grin. "That was bloody brilliant, mate," Mike said, slapping him on the back. "I knew you still had it in you." Jason shrugged, his expression nonchalant. "He was reckless," he replied. "Too busy showing off to pay attention to the basics. And honestly, I didn't come here to fight. You sure know how to drag me into trouble, Mike." Mike chuckled, but his eyes sparkled with pride. "Well, trouble seems to find you, Jason. You just have a way of making it look good." Jason smirked but didn't respond. He leaned back in his chair, hoping the night would settle down now that the impromptu showdown was over. But fate had other plans. As the next fight began, Jason could feel eyes on him. Not the usual fan stares or admiring glances. This was something more intense, more deliberate. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of a man sitting in one of the VIP boxes above the arena. The man was tall, dressed in a sleek black suit, his piercing eyes locked onto Jason like a predator sizing up its prey. Mike noticed Jason's shift in focus. "Something wrong?" he asked, following Jason's gaze. "Don't know yet," Jason murmured. "But that guy's been staring for a while." Mike squinted up at the VIP section. "That's Viktor Krylov," he said, his tone darkening. "He's one of the big shots in the underground fight circuit. Runs illegal matches all over Europe. Real shady business." Jason raised an eyebrow. "And why is he watching me like that?" "Hard to say," Mike admitted. "But if I had to guess, he just saw an opportunity. You embarrassed Blake Harris in front of a global audience, and now Krylov probably thinks you're a ticket to some serious money." Jason exhaled slowly, already disliking where this was headed. "I'm not interested," he said flatly. "Whatever he's thinking, it's not my problem." But even as he said it, he could feel the weight of Krylov's gaze, and something told him this wasn't the last he'd hear of the man. Sure enough, as the night drew to a close and Jason prepared to leave the arena, he found himself intercepted. Two men in sharp suits, clearly bodyguards, stepped into his path as he walked toward the exit. "Mr. Statham," one of them said, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Krylov would like to have a word with you." Jason stopped, his instincts kicking in. He glanced over his shoulder to see Mike tense up behind him, ready for trouble. Turning back to the bodyguards, Jason's face remained impassive. "Tell Mr. Krylov I'm not interested." The bodyguard didn't flinch. "Mr. Krylov insists. He's waiting for you in his private suite." Jason crossed his arms, his tone sharpening. "Listen, mate, I've had a long night. Tell your boss I'm flattered, but I'm going home." The bodyguards exchanged a glance, and for a moment Jason thought they might try to strong-arm him. But then one of them spoke again, his voice quieter, almost a whisper. "It's about Blake Harris." That gave Jason pause. He could sense there was more to this than met the eye. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Lead the way." Mike grabbed his arm. "You sure about this, Jason? These guys don't play fair." Jason's gave him a reassuring look. "Relax, Mike. I'll hear him out. That's all." The bodyguards escorted Jason to the VIP suite, a luxurious space overlooking the arena. Viktor Krylov stood by the window, sipping a glass of whiskey. He turned as Jason entered, a slick smile spreading across his face. "Ah, Mr. Statham," Krylov said, his accent thick but his English polished. "What an honor to finally meet you. Please, have a seat." Jason remained standing, his posture unyielding. "Let's skip the pleasantries. What do you want?" Krylov chuckled, unbothered by Jason's bluntness. "You're a man who doesn't waste time. I like that. Very well. I'll get straight to the point. Blake Harris, he's one of my fighters." Jason's eyes narrowed. And, Krylov continued, "You humiliated him tonight. That doesn't sit well with me. But instead of taking offense, I see an opportunity. You have talent, Mr. Statham. Real talent. I'd like to offer you a place in my organization." Jason's jaw tightened. "Not interested." Krylov's smile didn't waver, but his eyes grew colder. "Think carefully before you refuse. This isn't just a job offer. It's an invitation to something much bigger. Fame, fortune, power. All yours if you're willing to step into the ring again." Jason stepped closer, his voice like steel. "I don't care what you're offering. I'm not for sale." Krylov's smile finally faded. He set down his glass, his demeanor turning deadly serious. "Then I hope you're ready for the consequences of saying no." Jason stood his ground, his sharp eyes locked on Viktor Krylov, who now wore a faint smirk, one that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Jason didn't flinch, didn't waver. He had faced countless villains on screen, but he knew this man was the real deal. Krylov wasn't bluffing. "Let me make this easy for you," Jason said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not a fighter, and I'm definitely not your puppet. Whatever game you're playing, count me out." Krylov let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head as if amused. "Mr. Statham, you think this is a game? No, this is business. And in my business, people like you don't get to walk away without consequences." Jason's jaw tightened. "I already said no. I'm walking out of here, and if you're smart, you won't try to stop me." Krylov's smile vanished. He nodded to one of his bodyguards, who stepped forward, blocking the door. Jason's instincts kicked in, his muscles tensing as he prepared for what might come next. Krylov tilted his head, as if he were studying Jason, calculating his next move. "You don't understand, do you?" Krylov said, his tone calm but laced with menace. "You embarrassed one of my top fighters, a man I've invested a great deal of time and money in. That kind of humiliation doesn't just disappear. The world saw Blake Harris fall, and now they'll question my entire organization. Do you know how bad that is for business?" Jason took a step closer, his expression darkening. "You're blaming me because your fighter couldn't back up his trash talk? That's not my problem." Krylov chuckled again, but there was no humor in it. "No, Mr. Statham, you're mistaken. It is your problem now. You see, in my line of work, respect is everything. And if I let you walk away after what happened tonight, I lose mine. So here's how this is going to work." Krylov stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're going to fight again. Officially, this time. I'll set up the match and you'll step into the ring. If you win, you walk away with your dignity, maybe even some money. If you lose, well, let's just say you'll pay for tonight's little stunt." Jason's fist clenched, his temper beginning to flare. He was used to dealing with people who thought they could intimidate him, but Krylov was different. This wasn't a Hollywood villain playing a role. This was a man who lived by threats and violence, and Jason knew he wouldn't hesitate to back them up. "And if I say no?" Jason asked, his voice as cold as Krylov's. Krylov's smile returned, but this time it was cruel. "Then I make an example of you. Not in the ring, but in other ways. Perhaps your friends, your family. Accidents happen all the time, don't they?" Jason's heart sank, but his face remained a mask of calm. He hated men like Krylov, men who used power and fear to control others. He had spent years training to play tough, but this wasn't a movie. This was real, and the stakes were higher than he had anticipated. Before Jason could respond, the door to the suite opened, and Mike burst in, his face a mixture of anger and concern. "Jason, what the hell's going on here?" he demanded, glaring at Krylov. Krylov raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by the interruption. "Ah, Mr. Carson," he said smoothly. "I remember you. You used to be quite the fighter back in the day. Shame you never had the vision to join my organization. Maybe you'd still be relevant." Mike ignored the jab and turned to Jason. "You don't owe this guy anything. Let's go." Jason hesitated, but only for a moment. He looked Krylov dead in the eye. "We're done here." Krylov's smile faded completely. He nodded to his bodyguards, and suddenly the room felt a lot smaller. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Statham," Krylov said, his tone icy. "One you won't live to regret." Jason didn't respond. He followed Mike out of the suite, his mind racing. As they exited the arena, Mike grabbed his arm. "You okay? What did he say to you?" Jason shook his head. "He's trying to drag me into something. Wants me to fight for him." Mike cursed under his breath. "That guy's dangerous, Jason. If he's set his sights on you, he won't let it go." Jason stopped and turned to his friend. "Then we'll make him let it go. I'm not going to let some thug dictate my life." Mike looked at him, concern etched on his face. "You don't know how far this guy's reach goes. He doesn't play fair. If he wants something, he'll do whatever it takes to get it. You've got to be careful." Jason nodded, but his jaw was set. He wasn't going to back down. If Krylov wanted a fight, he'd get one, but not on Krylov's terms. As they walked out into the cool night air, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Krylov wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and if Jason was going to take him on, he'd need to be ready for whatever was coming next. The night was colder than usual, the air biting against Jason's skin as he and Mike exited the arena. The streets were still alive with fans, vendors, and journalists, the energy from the night's fights lingering in the city like a storm that refused to dissipate. Jason pulled up the collar of his jacket, his mind racing. He wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, but this wasn't just about him anymore. Krylov had hinted at dragging others into his twisted game, friends, family. That changed everything. Mike walked beside him, his expression grim. "We can't just let this slide," he said finally, breaking the silence. You saw the look in Krylov's eyes. "He's not bluffing." Jason sighed, running a hand through his stubble. "I know," he muttered. "But I'm not about to let some glorified thug pull me into his world. I've dealt with worse." Mike stopped abruptly, grabbing Jason's arm and forcing him to face him. Have you? This isn't a movie, Jason. This guy isn't some script villain you can outwit with clever lines and a perfectly timed explosion. He's real and he's dangerous. I've seen what he's capable of. Jason looked at his friend, his jaw tightening. So what do you suggest, Mike, huh? I roll over and let him win? That's not who I am. Mike hesitated, then sighed. No, I know it's not. But you're going to need a plan. If you're going to stand up to Krylov, you can't do it alone. Jason smirked faintly. When have I ever done anything alone? Mike didn't laugh. His face was dead serious. I'm not kidding, Jason. Krylov's got connections. Fighters, criminals, people who owe him favors. If you step into his world, you'd better be ready for a fight that doesn't end when the bell rings. Jason nodded, his smirk fading. He knew Mike was right. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of walking away. Krylov wouldn't let it go. Jason would have to take the fight to him, but he'd do it on his own terms. The next morning, Jason was up early, his mind already working. He didn't want to involve anyone else, but he needed to know more about Krylov. If he was going to fight back, he needed to understand the man's operations, his weaknesses, his patterns. Jason had spent years training for roles where strategy and precision were key. Now it was time to put those lessons to real use. He made a few calls, reaching out to old contacts, stunt coordinators who dabbled in the underground circuit, former fighters who had crossed paths with Krylov's organization, and even a private investigator he'd worked with on a film. Piece by piece, a picture of Krylov's empire began to form. Krylov wasn't just running illegal fights. He was deeply entrenched in organized crime. Gambling, extortion, trafficking. His fight circuit was just the tip of the iceberg. And his fighters? Most of them were either desperate for money or too scared to say no. Krylov had a way of making people feel trapped, and once they were in his grip, getting out was nearly impossible. Jason leaned back in his chair, the weight of the information settling over him. Krylov wasn't just a thug. He was a predator, and Jason had unwittingly painted a target on his back by defying him. Later that day, as Jason was heading out to meet Mike at a nearby gym, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street from his apartment. The windows were tinted, but he could feel the eyes watching him. He didn't react, didn't let on that he'd noticed. Instead, he slipped into his car and drove off, taking a deliberately winding road through the city. Sure enough, the SUV followed him. Jason's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he remained calm. He had dealt with tailing scenes in countless films, and now he was putting that knowledge to use. He made sharp turns, drove through crowded streets, and even doubled back a few times. Eventually, the SUV broke off, vanishing into the flow of traffic. Jason pulled into the gym parking lot, his heart pounding, but his face calm. Inside, Mike was waiting, his arms crossed and his expression tense. "You're late," Mike said, but his tone softened when he saw Jason's face. "What happened?" "I'm being watched," Jason said simply. "Krylov's got people following me." Mike swore under his breath. "I told you this wasn't going to be easy," Jason nodded. "I know. That's why we need to be ready. If Krylov thinks he can intimidate me, he's got another thing coming." Mike hesitated, then stepped closer. "What's the plan, Jason? You can't just wait for him to make a move." Jason looked at his friend, a steely determination in his eyes. "We don't wait," he said. "We take the fight to him." Jason knew the fight had to start now, on his terms. He wasn't going to sit back and let Viktor Krylov play games with his life. The stakes were too high, and Jason's instincts told him that waiting would only give Krylov more control. If Krylov wanted to intimidate him, he'd find out soon. Enough that Jason Statham wasn't the kind of man to scare easily. The first step was information. Jason and Mike spent the next few hours at the gym, not training but strategizing. Mike, being a veteran of the MMA circuit, knew the underground world well enough to provide some valuable insights. "Krylov runs his empire like a fortress," Mike explained, sitting across from Jason in the gym's empty office. "He's careful, paranoid even. But he's got weak spots, he always does. His fighters are loyal because they're scared, not because they trust him. That's where we start." Jason leaned forward, his mind already racing with possibilities. "We need to find someone on the inside," he said. "Someone who knows how his operation works. Someone who wants out." Mike frowned. "That's a tall order. Most of Krylov's guys are too terrified to talk. The ones who've tried? Let's just say they don't last long." Jason's jaw tightened. "There's always someone," he said firmly. "I just need to figure out who." That night, Jason began his search. He started with one of his old contacts, a man named Liam, who had worked as a fight promoter before falling out with the underground scene. Liam had always been a slippery character, but Jason knew he had an ear to the ground. They met at a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city, a place where the music was loud and no one asked too many questions. Liam was waiting in a corner booth, nursing a drink and looking as jittery as ever. His wiry frame and darting eyes made him look like a man who had spent too much time looking over his shoulder. "Jason," Liam said with a nervous smile as Jason slid into the booth. "Been a while? Didn't expect to see you back in this world." "I didn't expect to be back," Jason replied, his tone flat. "But here we are." Liam chuckled nervously, taking a sip of his drink. "So what can I do for you? You looking for a fight? Or maybe just some info?" "Info," Jason said, leaning closer. "I need to know about Krylov. Who's working for him? And who might be willing to flip?" Liam's smile faltered. "Krylov, huh? That's dangerous territory. Mate, you sure you want to poke that bear?" Jason's gaze hardened. "I don't have a choice." He made it personal. Liam hesitated, glancing around the bar as if expecting Krylov's men to materialize out of the shadows. "All right," he said finally, lowering his voice. "There's a guy. Goes by the name of Dima. He's one of Krylov's trainers. Used to be a fighter himself, but his knees are shot. Word is he's not happy with Krylov. Something about money disputes and broken promises." "Where can I find him?" Jason asked. Liam shrugged. "He works out of one of Krylov's gyms, but he keeps a low profile. You'd have to get creative to get close to him." Jason nodded, already formulating a plan. "Thanks, Liam. I owe you one." Liam gave a weak laugh. "Just don't tell Krylov where you got this info, yeah? I'd rather not end up in a dumpster." Jason smirked faintly. "Your secret's safe with me." The next day, Jason staked out the gym Liam had mentioned. It was a nondescript building, in a rundown part of town, the kind of place that didn't draw much attention. Jason watched from his car, taking note of who came and went. Most of the fighters were young, rough-looking guys, exactly the type Krylov preyed on. But after a few hours, Jason spotted his target. Dima was older, his limp noticeable as he stepped out of the gym and lit a cigarette. He had the weary look of a man who had seen too much and had little left to lose. Jason waited until Dima was alone before making his move. He approached casually, his hands in his pockets. "Dima," he said, his voice calm but firm. Dima glanced up, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "Jason Statham," Jason said simply. "I need to talk to you." Dima scoffed, taking a drag of his cigarette. "I know who you are. You're the guy who made a fool out of Blake Harris. What do you want with me?" Jason stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I hear you're not too happy with Krylov. I'm looking to take him down, and I could use your help." Dima snorted, shaking his head. "Take him down? You're either brave or stupid, mate, probably both. Krylov's untouchable." "No one's untouchable," Jason said, his tone sharp. "Not if you know where to hit them." "And you do, don't you?" Dima hesitated, his cigarette burning down to the filter. "Even if I did, why would I risk it? Krylov doesn't forgive. And he doesn't forget." Jason's eyes locked onto Dima's. "Because if we don't stop him, he'll keep ruining lives. He'll keep using people like you until there's nothing left. And because I'm not going to back down. With or without your help." Dima studied Jason for a long moment, then sighed. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll talk. But if we're doing this, we do it my way. Krylov's got eyes everywhere." Jason nodded. "Your way it is." As Dima began to share what he knew, Jason realized he was finally getting the upper hand. Krylov's empire had cracks, and Jason was about to exploit every single one of them. Dima leaned against the brick wall outside the gym, lowering his voice as he began to speak. His eyes darted around nervously, scanning the street for any sign of Krylov's men. Jason stood calmly, his arms crossed, letting Dima take his time. He knew the man had every reason to be afraid, but Jason needed him to focus. "Krylov runs everything like a damn machine," Dima said, taking a final drag of his cigarette before flicking it to the ground. "Illegal fights, gambling rings, smuggling, he's got his hands in all of it. But the fights are his bread and butter. That's where the real money comes in." Jason nodded. "And the fighters? They're just pawns to him?" Dima snorted. "Pawns, slaves, call them what you want. Most of them are desperate kids who think they're getting a shot at the big time. Krylov promises them money, fame, whatever they want. But once they sign on, they're trapped. They lose a fight? They're in debt? They try to leave? Well, let's just say no one gets out clean. Jason's jaw tightened, his anger simmering just below the surface. And you? Why are you still here? Dima hesitated, looking away. Because I don't have a choice, he muttered. Krylov owns me. He paid for my surgeries when my knees went out. Said I owed him for the rest of my life. Now I train his fighters, keep them in shape, and look the other way when things get ugly. Jason stepped closer, his voice firm but not unkind. You've got a choice now. You help me bring him down, and I'll make sure you walk away from this. No debts, no strings. You'll be free. Dima looked up, his eyes searching Jason's face for any sign of deceit. After a long moment, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. If we're doing this, there's one thing you need to know. Krylov's got a big event coming up, a private fight night, invitation only. It's where he brings in his VIPs, the high rollers, the big gamblers. If you're looking to hit him where it hurts, that's your chance. Jason's mind raced. When is it? 2 days from now, Dima replied. He's hosting it at one of his warehouses on the outskirts of town. It's locked down tight, guards everywhere, cameras, the works. But if you can get inside... He trailed off, his meaning clear. Jason nodded, a plan already forming in his head. I'll get in. But I'm going to need more than just a location. I need to know his schedule, his security setup, everything, Dima sighed. I'll get you what I can, but you'd better be ready, Statham. Once you make a move on Krylov, there's no going back. Jason's eyes hardened. I've been ready since the moment he threatened me. For the next 2 days, Jason prepared. He trained harder than he had in years, pushing his body to its limits. He knew Krylov's men wouldn't fight fair, and he had to be ready for anything. Mike helped him set up mock scenarios, running drills and sparring with him until Jason's reflexes were razor sharp. Meanwhile, Dima kept his word. He provided Jason with detailed information about the fight night, the layout of the warehouse, the number of guards, and even the timing of Krylov's arrival. Jason learned that the main event of the night was a high-stakes fight featuring one of Krylov's top fighters, a brutal heavyweight named Viktor Kozlov. The event was meant to showcase Krylov's dominance, a spectacle for his VIP guests. Jason knew he couldn't just barge in and start a fight. He needed to be smart, to strike in a way that would not only humiliate Krylov, but also send a message to everyone in his operation. He needed to make Krylov vulnerable, to expose his empire for what it was. The night of the event arrived, and Jason was ready, dressed in dark clothes and carrying a small bag of supplies. He parked his car a few blocks away from the warehouse and approached on foot. The building was massive, surrounded by high fences and patrolled by armed guards. Floodlights illuminated the area, and Jason could hear the muffled sounds of music and voices from inside. He circled the perimeter, staying in the shadows until he found what he was looking for, a small side entrance guarded by a single man. Jason waited until the guard turned his back, then moved in silently. In one swift motion, he grabbed the man from behind, applying a chokehold until the guard slumped unconscious. Jason dragged him into the shadows and slipped inside the warehouse. The interior was even more elaborate than Jason had expected. The main area had been transformed into an arena, complete with a cage in the center and tiered seating for the VIPs. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of expensive liquor. Wealthy guests mingled and laughed, placing bets as Krylov's fighters warmed up for their matches. Jason moved through the shadows, careful to avoid drawing attention. Dima's intel had been spot on. The security was tight, but the guards were focused on the main entrances and the VIP section, leaving gaps in other areas. Jason used those gaps to his advantage, making his way toward the control room where the event's cameras and lights were being monitored. Inside the control room, Jason quickly overpowered the lone technician, tying him up and taking control of the equipment. From here, he had a clear view of the entire event. He could see Krylov sitting in a luxurious chair near the cage, surrounded by bodyguards and laughing with his guests. Jason's jaw clenched at the sight of him. Taking a deep breath, Jason reached for the microphone connected to the warehouse's sound system. It was time to make his move. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Jason's voice boomed through the speakers, silencing the crowd. All eyes turned to the control room as Jason stepped into view, his face calm but deadly serious. Welcome to tonight's event. I hope you're all enjoying the show. Krylov's face darkened and he shot to his feet, barking orders at his men. Jason continued undeterred. I've got a little announcement to make. Tonight's main event isn't what you think it is. Tonight, we're exposing the truth about Viktor Krylov and his little empire. The crowd erupted into chaos as Jason's words echoed through the warehouse. Guards scrambled to locate him, but Jason was already on the move, slipping out of the control room and disappearing into the shadows. The fight had begun, and Jason was ready for war. Chaos erupted inside the warehouse as Jason's voice echoed through the sound system, throwing Krylov's carefully orchestrated event into disarray. The wealthy VIPs, who had been laughing and drinking moments earlier, now looked around in confusion and fear. Some were already making their way toward the exits, while others remained frozen in their seats, unsure of what was happening. Krylov's face was a mask of fury as he barked orders at his guards. "Find him! Now!" he roared, slamming his fist against the armrest of his chair. His men scattered, weapons drawn, but their movements were frantic and uncoordinated. Jason had already thrown the entire event into chaos, and Krylov's empire was beginning to show cracks. Meanwhile, Jason moved silently through the shadows, staying one step ahead of Krylov's men. He had memorized the layout of the warehouse, thanks to Dima's intel, and he knew exactly where he needed to go next. His goal wasn't just to disrupt the event, it was to expose Krylov's operation to the world. To do that, he needed hard evidence, and he knew exactly where to find it. He slipped into an office near the back of the warehouse, where Krylov kept his records. The room was locked, but Jason made quick work of the door using a small lockpicking tool he'd brought with him. Inside, the office was filled with filing cabinets, computers, and stacks of documents. Jason wasted no time pulling out his phone and snapping pictures of everything. Ledgers detailing illegal transactions, lists of fighters trapped in Krylov's debt, and even payments to corrupt officials who helped Krylov keep his operation running. As Jason worked, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Krylov's men were closing in. He quickly stuffed a handful of the most damning documents into his bag and prepared to make his escape. Just as he turned to leave the office, door burst open and 2 armed guards stormed in. "There he is," one of them shouted, raising his weapon. Jason moved like lightning. He grabbed a heavy paperweight from the desk and hurled it at the first guard, hitting him square in the face. The man stumbled back, dropping his weapon. Jason closed the distance in an instant, disarming the second guard with a swift, precise strike. A quick roundhouse kick sent the man crashing into the wall, unconscious. The first guard tried to recover, but Jason was on him before he could reach his weapon. He delivered a series of rapid strikes, finishing with an elbow to the jaw that sent the man to the floor. Jason stood over them for a moment, catching his breath before slipping back into the shadows. Back in the main area, Krylov was growing, increasingly desperate. His guards were spread thin, chasing shadows as Jason continued to elude them. The VIPs had begun to flee en masse, their expensive suits and gowns disappearing into the night as the once lavish event descended into chaos. Krylov's reputation was crumbling before his eyes, and he knew it. Just as Krylov was about to leave his seat, the arena lights suddenly dimmed, and the massive screens above the cage flickered to life. Jason's voice came through the speakers again, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thought you might like to see what your host has been up to behind the scenes," Jason said. The screens displayed the pictures he had taken of Krylov's records, evidence of illegal activities, corrupt dealings, and the exploitation of countless fighters. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the evidence scrolled across the screens, exposing the full extent of Krylov's empire. Krylov's face turned red with rage. "Turn it off," he bellowed, but his men were powerless to stop it. Jason had locked the controls from the office, ensuring that the evidence would play on a loop for everyone to see. As the crowd reacted, Jason made his way back toward the main area. He had one more move to make. Krylov was vulnerable now, his operation exposed, but Jason wanted to ensure that Krylov would never be able to rebuild. He needed to confront him directly. Jason emerged from the shadows and stepped into the arena, his presence commanding the attention of everyone still inside. Krylov's bodyguards moved to intercept him, but Jason didn't slow down. He fought with precision and efficiency, taking down one guard after another. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jason worked his way toward Krylov, his movements a blur of skill and power. Krylov stood frozen, his usual confidence shattered. He had built his empire on fear and control, but now he was face to face with a man who couldn't be intimidated. Jason climbed into the cage, his eyes locked on Krylov. "It's over," he said, his voice echoing through the arena. "Your empire, your reputation, it's all gone. You're finished," Krylov sneered, trying to regain some of his composure. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Jason stepped closer, his expression deadly serious. "I'm not walking away. I'm making sure you pay for everything you've done. Krylov lunged at Jason, but Jason was ready. The two men clashed in the center of the cage, the crowd erupting into cheers and shouts. Krylov fought with brute strength, but Jason's speed and technique gave him the upper hand. Blow after blow landed with precision, and it wasn't long before Krylov was on the ground, defeated. Jason stood over him, breathing heavily. "This is for everyone you've hurt," he said, his voice low. He turned and walked away, leaving Krylov lying in the center of the cage as the crowd erupted in applause. As Jason left the warehouse, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Dima had kept his promise and tipped off the authorities, ensuring that Krylov and his operation would be dismantled for good. Jason glanced over his shoulder one last time, a faint smile on his lips. The fight was over, and for the first time in a long while he felt a sense of peace. "Let's go, Mike," Jason said as he climbed into his car. "We've got a long night ahead." Mike grinned. "I don't know how you do it, mate, but you sure know how to make an impression." Jason chuckled. "It's what I do." As they drove off into the night, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Krylov's empire was in ruins, and the lives of countless fighters had been saved. It wasn't the kind of victory he had planned for, but it was a victory nonetheless, and Jason Statham never lost.